Let me. No, you say your name. I am.
All right, I am Christopher Adam Wozniak. In 1968, I was 10 years old, going on 11, and I remember the summer of '68. Yes. And you want me to expound on my memories of 1968? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the Democratic National Convention and the response by the establishment, as they were known back then, Chairman Daley, and I forget the police commissioner's name. I used to know it. But I remember the curfews. I remember being told to be back in the house by 7 p.m. in the evening, and we could go in the backyard, but we couldn't leave the yard. And I remember a couple friends coming over, obviously breaking the curfew, but overall, people tended to respond to it, you know, at least the younger people, accordingly. Now, some of those meaner adolescents who go down to Grant Park and practice how to fight the police and battle for the right to protest, and partly protesting the Vietnam War and partly protesting just government intervention in their lives in general, I believe. And there was just a major backlash against the establishment. Anybody over 30 couldn't be trusted. And the music reflected that. People had protest songs starting earlier in the 60s, but certainly 68 was sort of a milestone year for that kind of thing. I remember a lot of people who knew people who went to Vietnam had a certain amount of angst over it, and quite frankly didn't always know how to act or react to the things that they were going through. I think there was a lot of blame placed on soldiers who went either because they were drafted or they felt it was their duty or whatever. And I remember specifically my sister Barbara was dating a Green Beret. I'm not sure if I even ever met the guy, maybe I did once, but he had a tape recorder, a little reel-to-reel tape recorder, and he would send tapes back from Vietnam about his experiences. And I don't remember much of the detail. One thing I do remember, though, is that him talking about being out on patrol and being away from supply bases and having to eat dog once. That kind of stuck with me. But I also remember that when Barbara would send him letters, she would take a wax stamp, a little, like a brass handle that would put a peace sign in the wax to seal the letter, seal the envelope. And he asked her never to do that again, because when that would show up at the military base with a little peace sign on the back, it was taken as a affront to what their mission was, and didn't go over real well, let's put it that way. But let me see what else I remember. Certainly a lot of the stores, particularly the hardware stores, banning the sale of like oven cleaner and certain things. People would use styrofoam balls, drive nails through them to throw at the police. And so there was, depending on your age, of course, you went in to buy such things. I think even eggs for a while. If you went in and bought a large quantity of eggs, you were seen as suspect. And there were probably some bans on other things that I wasn't aware of. And certainly recall the local police, because I think at the time about 75% of the Chicago police lived in our immediate neighborhood. So a lot of the kids I knew, fathers, were on the police force, and there was concern that, you know, some of this could turn into riots in our neighborhood, whether they were racially motivated or Vietnam protesters, the Yippies and the Students for Democratic Society, or whoever. And there was sort of this us and them approach to things, and a lot of the police, you know, were talking amongst themselves and indicated that they had automatic weapons and things, and they were ready for the people, you know, if they came into the neighborhood, they were ready to deal with them. So that's, I mean, I guess as far as that convention goes, and then all the footage on TV with the police battling physically with batons, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Richard Daley gave the order shoot to kill If there was trouble downtown, then the police had the right to use deadly force, as opposed to having some ostensible probable cause mechanism. It was more about protecting the police and protecting the local area, which at the time, the downtown area and Grand Park area was not exactly an exclusive neighborhood, and granted, people had shops and things that they valued and things, but it wasn't a place that a lot of people from more in the northern part of the city or out on the outskirts, or certainly the suburbs, wanted to go, just because it was still considered somewhat of a dangerous area to just go, even for whether you went downtown to see a play or a concert or just to shop. You certainly wanted to be out of there by nightfall. There was one of our neighbors, I remember, that was attacked in a parking lot by 3 guys, and I know he never forgot it. He used it to justify, his racism, saying the brothers were after him. And I don't remember spending much time downtown, maybe a few times for shopping trips in the afternoon with mom or dad or something, but not really going downtown much. A few times we did at that young age, surprisingly, go down to like Wrigley Field to see a ball game, just a few of the kids. It's pretty astounding, because nowadays, having a 12-year-old son, I would never consider him and a couple of his buddies getting on the metro in D.C. to go to a baseball game, even though its neighborhood is improving where they built the ballpark and things. It's a very different era. We thought nothing of getting on our bikes or getting on the bus, going to a movie theater or whatever, going to the store. And I don't think a single time in Chris's life, now that he's 12, I don't think he's ever been to the store by himself or with his friends. It's always, you have to drive him and everything, and wait in the parking lot and be careful. It's, perhaps we're more aware, perhaps we're more paranoid, but it could also be that it's just a very different world. So I think there was some innocence lost, certainly in '68 and '69 afterwards, where there were some radical changes, and even some people that would have normally probably been considered part of the establishment sort of turned around and said, maybe the war was a bad idea from the start. Some of them, were musicians, and others were politicians, and they tended to move away from sort of the establishment view. Certainly moved away from, people like General Westmoreland or Robert McNamara, and certainly Nixon. After LBJ said he wouldn't run again, and they certainly even today blame the Democrats, particularly Kennedy and Johnson, for getting us into that quagmire. But the truth is that we had advisors on the ground that supposedly had non-military missions, but were definitely involved in setting up the South Vietnamese for military action as early as the time I was born, in the late 50s. And even though the French had failed miserably in Vietnam, gone through the whole prisoner exchange thing and the whole MIA issue, we apparently weren't listening. Decided to try the same hand over the fear of communism causing a domino effect and things falling from Vietnam and other countries into what was then called Indochina. But I think people now, even though McNamara wrote about it a long time ago, his recent death, rekindled a lot of the thinking that basically the whole theory that communism was going to grow and be a dominant political philosophy in the world if Vietnam fell was clearly mistaken, and an overreaction that was coming out of the 50s with Joe McCarthy and the whole un-American, I forget what they called it. It's a committee on un-American activities or something that he ran, where people were blacklisted if they had ever had any affiliation with the Communist Party or friends were in the Communist Party, and they didn't publicly denounce them. Some people were able to sort of live through that and survive and even prosper. People who were powerful, like Howard Hughes and some others, basically told the committee to go stuff it. And there's actually a movie about that called The Front with Woody Allen, which doesn't talk about Howard Hughes, but talks about, Zero Mostel and others, actors in particular, television actors who were basically bumped off of any list that would be considered for a television show, and ended up working small clubs, if they worked at all, for relatively little pay because nobody wanted to be associated with somebody that they thought was a commie or pinko, and certainly shattered a lot of lives. So that, I think, is the sort of the prelude to the 60s, and people in the younger generation either didn't know about that or I think forgot some of that and weren't willing to tolerate the establishment view that communism was this inherent evil, and there were people, particularly Jews, infiltrating the State Department and the television networks and, getting secret messages out about communism, and it was just basically a lot of paranoia. And I think some of those people ultimately paid for it. Certainly McCarthy's remembered as a pariah more than anything.
What do you remember happening in the neighborhood and among the families of the neighborhood and your friends? And you mentioned that your sister having a boyfriend. Anything along that line where it's personal memories of changes? If not in '68, anywhere in that era.
Well, certainly, there was a lot of grief over Vietnam in particular, and I remember, I don't remember if it was in '68, if not, it was very close, maybe '69. I remember being in Canada, and we picked up a soldier in uniform who was hitchhiking, and he seemed a bit surprised that we were willing to pick him up, number one, because a lot of the soldiers who returned, some of them were actually even physically accosted. And, there's one story I remember of a guy getting shot with a fire extinguisher and being called a baby killer and all this kind of stuff. And I also remember a lot of the American kids who were in their late teens, early 20s, who were dodging the draft and gone to Ontario predominantly, seeing our license plates and yelling at us and flipping us off and saying, "Yankee, go home." They didn't want us established, because I think the other thing is we were driving in a Cadillac, so we were clearly establishment. And that kind of stuck with me. I don't remember as much about the details as how it affected my friends, because at the time, being 10 or 11, we weren't really concerned about the war per se in a true sense. We knew a couple people, older people, who'd gone off, gotten drafted. And certainly I remember my brother Paul, in the lottery for the draft and people being worried about when's my number going to come up. But by the time I was 18 and went down to get my draft card, they told me they stopped the week before requiring draft cards. It was over. So I was certainly somewhat relieved, but I also remember having a discussion with my grandfather and him explaining to me that it was the correct thing to do to go to war if you were drafted, or even if you weren't drafted, it was a patriotic thing to do, to go to Vietnam or wherever you were called. And he said it was certainly not proper to be going to Canada or anywhere else. And it wasn't until a bit later that I thought about it and realized that, in fact, he was a draft dodger. And that's how we ended up in the United States. And that when the Russians and the Japanese got into it, and I think it was 1903 or 4, and war was imminent, the Russians were pulling a lot of Poles as cheap labor and as army privates and officers and things into the war effort, and he didn't want to be part of that. Certainly being in Poland, he didn't see it as Poland's war, so he used that and jumped a ship and came over and had essentially no money. He told me about passing money back up the ship at Ellis Island, because you had to have certain $20, $30 in your pocket to land, and so one guy would get off and then toss the money back up after he'd shown it to somebody, and other guys would get off and sign the book and start their life. But I don't remember much. As I say, most of my friends, being that age, were not politically concerned particularly. I remember reading some things that my brother Paul wrote and Rising Up Angry in the Seed and other publications, notable periodicals, and I remember there are some people, older people, being particularly concerned about, things that Lenin or Marx had written And that's Karl Marx, not Groucho Marx, by the way. Groucho Marx was still in vogue. But I remember also, the other thing I remember, and I still have it, I remember the Firesign Theater presentations using sort of a military theme to a lot of their comedy, and talking about how, you know, things aren't available in Sector R after midnight, and, you know, their father running to be dog killer again this year, and using everything in a very military style, and then bringing in people who were more laid back draft dodger types as part of the comedy and things. And that was, you know, at the time I don't think I appreciated all the comedy. Now I do more when I listen to it, but it was very, you know, poignant at the time. And you know, the funny thing is whatever, 40 years later, you still listen to it, and occasionally you'll pick up new things, new sort of nuances to the comedy, or mentions of things that didn't make sense to you before. So it's, I think that's part of the record, that and the Virgin Fugs, having a lot of their, I've bought a couple of their CDs the last few years. They had a lot of, not technologically or musicologically precise music. It was entertainment, but it was extremely politically motivated, and that was the purpose of it. It wasn't a rock beat to dance to or anything like that. It was just about getting a message out. And they were certainly, I'm sure, on you know, the other part of it is that the FBI had dossiers on everybody who was considered a suspect, and you could be considered a suspect for any variety of reasons, apparently. I mean, I've heard lists of people who are on that list who had files in J. Edgar Hoover's office or whatever, that you didn't have to do much to get on that list, you know, if somebody just didn't like you. And then I remember Robert Kennedy making a stink about, you know, both organized crime, which he was against, but also, you know, some of this politically motivated evaluation, if you want to call it, of just citizens who thought they were doing what was provided by the Constitution, being legal, being able to protest, speak out, etc. And I do remember specifically when who was killed. I remember waking up, and he had been killed in L.A., and I was probably already in bed by that time, and the next morning waking up to the radio and listening to the whole thing, the tape played back and back and back and forth about Sirhan and Rosie Greer sitting on the assailant till the police got him, and then of course they announced he was dead. And since I remembered his brother dying in '63, JFK, then you know, it really was quite shocking that two brothers of you know, a very strong political family would both be, you know, gunned down within 6 years of each other. It was quite phenomenal. And I don't remember much about my parents saying anything much about it. I'm sure they were upset by it, but I just don't remember them discussing politics a whole lot. Certainly they had views on things, but I think by and large, at least from my experience, they didn't talk a whole lot about Democrats versus Republicans. They didn't talk that much about Nixon versus LBJ. And there are times where I remember in political science class, the teacher asking us, you know, what did your parents do? Did they vote for this? What did they tell you about this? And I just don't remember much of it. I don't think they did talk about it, at least to me. And maybe that's a good thing, because then I could consider myself more middle of the road and independent and have the ability to make up my mind, as opposed to a lot of other people I know who, particularly depending on what state they were born in, are Republican almost by birth or Democrat by birth, and they're never going to consider an alternative view because, you know, it's just not the way Daddy did it or whatever, you know. It was just written in stone.
Did they talk about the war?
Who?
You know, the folks, especially when I wasn't around, did.
I don't remember parents saying too much about it. I'm sure when things came on the news and there was a body count and people realized Westmoreland was playing with the figures, the casualties and things, to make it look like we were winning. And there are some veterans who still argue we were winning. We clearly, militarily speaking, were winning, but we had lost the hearts and minds of the people back home. I'm sure, especially Dad probably made comments, you know, something about it, but I just don't remember anything specific. Him coming out and saying, you know, this war is stupid or this war is the right thing. I don't remember him saying much about it at all. I do remember one of my friend's older brothers wanting to get a draft deferment because he had some sort of orthopedic issue with his right arm. And I didn't know anything about it at the time, that he was seeing my dad as a patient. But then his little brother let me know that the family was very unhappy because Dad wouldn't sign the deferment. He said, although you probably can't do some active combat, there's still plenty of places in the military where you could serve honorably. And so he ended up in Georgia working in a mailroom and doing odd things like that. And he learned to play pool very well there. I remember, because I played him in pool a few times. He was very good. But the family was certainly angry. They didn't want anybody going over to Vietnam, and that was the only older boy in that family. It was the Hirsch family that was eligible to go. By the time Jim, the guy that was more or less my age, became 18, he may have gotten a draft card briefly, but the war was over, basically. It was, 1975, and things were done with. And, I remember certainly the Paris peace talks and Kissinger going over and back and forth, and I don't know, the whole thing seemed a little bit ludicrous to me, in the sense that, if people wanted to establish peace and they wanted us to get the hell out of their country, which I could clearly understand, and I didn't know how much there was to discuss. Clearly, in retrospect, there are a lot of people who aided the Americans in South Vietnam who paid a price for it. Some of them escaped to the United States or France or Canada or elsewhere, but many of them, no doubt, suffered at the hands of Viet Cong once they took over Saigon and renamed it Ho Chi Minh City. So I was just there last fall in Ho Chi Minh City, and the people were very warm and welcoming, and there was no real discussion of the war. There was a sort of memorial thing. It was just basically like a junkyard with old military machinery from the Americans piled up for people to see and remember. But I was told that since I looked probably too young to have been involved in the war, it was no big deal. Some of the older folks that went over there apparently have been treated occasionally with a suspicious eye, because they figure, well, you may well have killed my cousin or my brother or my dad or whatever. But the people there were certainly interested in, trade and diplomacy and friendship, and there was no discussion of, you're an American Yankee imperialist dog, and, how dare you come into our country. So things have changed quite a bit.
Good. I think that's about it as far as my